Welcome to Lex Personis, the official podcast of the New England Law Review. My name is Agripino Kennedy, I use they/them pronouns, and I'm this year's podcast editor. And today I'm here with Marcus DiBacco, and we're going to talk about his comment on Kligler v. Attorney General, a decision coming out of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Marcus, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Marcus DiBacco. I'm here with Agripino. I'm happy to talk about this paper.
So Marcus, tell us briefly, what was your paper on and why did you pick this topic?
So this paper is on the case Kligler v. Attorney General in Massachusetts, and basically the main crux of this case, it's about an 80-page case, is on physician-assisted suicide and whether or not it should be a fundamental right under due process. The reason why I picked this, well, obviously, as you know, we had a certain amount of cases to pick from. But for me, I have a pretty large family on both sides of my family, and it's nice to have a large family because you get to know a lot of people, you get to have a lot of fun, go to fun events, but also, eventually those people pass on. And about a couple months before I wrote this paper, both my aunt and my grandmother died. And, in a lot of the ways that they died and the kind of circumstances surrounding it, there was a lot maybe that could have been done better. So when it came time to pick a topic, physician-assisted suicide and having kind of control over how you die and your death appealed to me as something to write about.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's important when we do our writing to come from a place where we have kind of a personal connection to the topic. It definitely helps. So could you explain to us how Massachusetts analyzes a fundamental right, and why is that approach distinct from the typical approach, and how does that kind of impact this topic?
That's a great question. So Massachusetts, along with the federal government, when identifying a fundamental right, they go through a process of what's known as a substantive due process. Now, there's really two main components of substantive due process to establish a fundamental right, which is really a right, that's innate, that can't be touched by the government, that all individuals have. The right to marry, like Obergefell v. Hodges, that was about same-sex marriage. That became a fundamental right through that case. And really the two elements for it are that it must be deeply rooted in the history and tradition of the nation, and that it must be implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. So another great example to think about is the First Amendment, right? Free speech. Without free speech, the government cannot function. People cannot exist in a society if they cannot speak freely. They can't develop, they can't learn, they can't grow. So those are both deeply rooted, as we know, right from the founding of the nation, part of the reason for the founding. And it's essential in ordered liberty. And without it, without free speech, we can't function. Massachusetts and other jurisdictions have taken a look at those two elements, and they've thought to themselves, well, really that a lot of people entitled to fundamental rights, a lot of people who deserve fundamental rights, have been denied them because they've also been denied the ability to participate in the democratic process, right? So going back to Obergefell v. Hodges, people interested in same-sex marriage, people who are gay or identify as LGBT, they've been ostracized from society, from community for such a long time that they haven't been included in the history of it. So it can't be deeply rooted in the history and tradition because there is no history and tradition for people who identify that way. So what the courts do now, or Massachusetts at least, and Massachusetts has set this now as its only standard, is that it'll go through history and tradition, it'll go through implicit in ordered liberty, but also they have to factor in reasoned judgment. They have to factor in what they've learned in their own life experience, the morals, the philosophies, the opinions of the people in the Commonwealth to see what can be deemed a fundamental right.
You said a little bit about people who have been sort of ostracized and denied this participation in the democratic process. And you've referred to this in your paper as a comprehensive approach. In what ways do you see some shortcomings to that comprehensive approach when dealing with something as specific as physician-assisted suicide? And who do you see that impacting the most?
Right. So the court itself refers to it as the comprehensive approach. The shortcomings, at least in my opinion, are this case, for example, where the court only really hears arguments that are raised to it. That's really all it can consider. So if somebody doesn't raise the proper argument, which I think is kind of the case here, I don't mean to just, speak ill of anybody, but I think that there are other arguments, other points of conversation that could have been raised that could have swayed the court. I think that's one shortcoming, right, is it depends on the arguments raised. I think another shortcoming of it is that by factoring reasoned judgment, we're relying on people to use their own opinion in making these decisions. We can't rely on this history and tradition because there is none. We have to rely on what people think and what they feel, and that doesn't always work well, especially when you're trying to provide somebody else's rights. As we saw with Dobbs, those rights can just as easily be taken away by somebody else's reasoned judgment.
So in your comment, you talked about how the SJC kind of gave credit to other jurisdictions not finding a fundamental right to physician-assisted suicide. But you also talked a little bit about modern social standards and legal standards. How do you kind of, I guess, marry those two concepts where we're giving a lot of credit to other jurisdictions, but not as much to the modern social standards of what is happening in the state of Massachusetts?
Right. So Massachusetts is not alone in not deciding that there's no constitutional right here. Every jurisdiction that this question has come before, federal or state, has decided the same way. The 11 or so jurisdictions which allow physician-assisted suicide have done so through statute. My thought on that is that Massachusetts is not new to being a pioneer in the field of fundamental rights and certainly in legal fields, and that we should continue to be a pioneer, and that 70% or so of people agree that physician-assisted suicide, as described in the paper and in the case, should be a fundamental right. Now, of course, public opinion doesn't necessarily influence the court's decision on what's a fundamental right, but I think that standard, along with the other things discussed, changes in how long people live and quality of life for that duration should be factored into this. For example, like a lot of people live longer now. They live longer. The quantity of the years of their lives are extended. There's more, right? Simply put. But the quality does not reach the length, right? We have a lot of life-saving treatment. We have a lot of life-sustaining treatment. Mm-hmm. But over the course of those years that we have continued to sustain people, their quality of life has gone down. And as a result, you have people who are basically artificially alive. Their bodies function even though their lives no longer function, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I know the court touched upon this, and you touched upon it as well. We do have a fundamental right to refusing treatment. Could you talk a little bit about how that differs and how you think that analysis is not the one that the court should be using?
Yes. So I think the real crux, the real summary, to put it in as few words as possible for it, are that there's a difference between killing and letting die. Now, ultimately, either way, it's the individual's choice, whether it's physician-assisted suicide or whether it's refusing medical treatment. Now, of course, there's the reason of refusing medical treatment. No one's allowed to touch you if you don't want them to touch you. That makes perfect sense. But the real difference is that in refusing medical treatment, you are simply allowing yourself to succumb to the illness or whatever is affecting you. If it's physician-assisted suicide, however, you are actively taking steps to ensure your death, right? You can refuse medical treatment either way. But in one case, in the right to refuse medical treatment leading to death, your refusal is what causes your death, right? The death is inevitable, but you just give in to it. In physician-assisted suicide, you're not necessarily going to die unless you take these affirmative steps to do so. So really the difference between them is killing and letting die. Mm-hmm. That's just how I differentiate the what I would consider to be the rights, and that's why the logic of right to refuse medical treatment does not apply to physician-assisted suicide.
And in your paper, you argue that it instead should go over or under privacy rights. Could you give a brief explanation as to how you got there?
Yes. So this is another thing key to that comprehensive approach, where in a lot of fundamental rights cases, they'll say this very specific situation, right to refuse medical treatment, some cases of freedom to marry, right? Same-sex marriage. They're very specific things. They're very specific rights. But when you're talking about the comprehensive approach, it's a more generalized right, like privacy, personal autonomy, so on and so forth. I didn't place this under personal autonomy completely because I'm worried about the current climate. And, it seems that some courts have taken steps to reduce people's say over personal autonomy. That being said, obviously this would fall partially under it, but I think it also applies to privacy, right? So in privacy, it's saying that the government should not be involved in people's making of their own decisions, right? That's really the crux of privacy. The government does not get to be involved. Now, privacy is not explicitly stated in the Bill of Rights or any of the amendments of the Constitution, but for centuries now, we've identified it as living in the penumbra of it, right? So privacy, the government doesn't get to say what you do with your body. And to me personally, what could be more important? What could be a more private decision than how you choose to die?
And I have a little bit of a quote here from your paper where you talk about the sanctity of individual free choice and self-determination. So does that kind of fit into your concept of privacy here? And I know you said you only partially touched upon autonomy, but do you think that privacy and autonomy are kind of joined together, inseparable in some way?
Yes, privacy and autonomy are certainly tied together, and it's the freedom of choice of what happens to you, what you choose to do with your life, that I think is really the main part of the issue here. Is, if somebody sees a desperate situation where people are in need of help, that it's probably not going to end well for the person seeing that they need help, but they go in anyways. That's perfectly acceptable, even though that's still, in one way or another, going to result in their death. In this case, people are deprived of that choice because they can't do it themselves per se, or because, the consequences might be a little bit different. I think the freedom to choose to do with your body, your life, falls into both personal autonomy, because obviously you're making a decision for yourself, and it falls into privacy because nobody else gets to say what you get to do with your life.
I think privacy is definitely an important aspect of this. And I also am calling back a little bit to this impact of other jurisdictions. You've mentioned that other jurisdictions have legalized it through legislation. Do you think that a more appropriate route for this in the state of Massachusetts would be through legislation, or do you think that the court should be recognizing it as fundamental through case law?
So I think in these cases, a combination of both is always good, right? The way I speak about physician-assisted suicide and the way many others do is that it's really only under certain criteria, right? 6 months left to live with a diagnosis, confirmed opinions from multiple physicians, that it's voluntary decision, that you have capacity to make the decision, that you're of sound mind, sound judgment, all that. So while I do view this as a fundamental right, and as such it should be protected by the court, I do understand that there's a lot that could go wrong with this. There's a lot of issues, there's a lot of difficulties, there's a lot of checks that need to be in place to make sure that the wrong people aren't, I don't mean the wrong people, I mean that people aren't wrongly making this decision. So I think that, established it as a fundamental right, but the legislature executes a law on how it's to be done. And I think that's very important in order to offer the appropriate protections. I will also like to note here that the court and, many experts have said that just because something has the potential to be abused, just because a right has the potential to be abused, does not mean that it's no longer a right, right? Freedom of speech we've seen it be abused plenty.
Yeah.
But it's still a right. It's still protected. It's still protected for a reason. So even though that there are these difficulties, that there are potential for abuse, I do believe physician-assisted suicide should be a fundamental right, and that it should be established as such by the court, and that the legislature should prescribe or entail these protections for it.
Which I think is kind of talking about this concept of judicial activism. Do you foresee any kind of complication if the court were to recognize this right prior to the legislature taking active on the structure of how it would play out? Any potential backlash or maybe a loss of respect for the court if they were to establish something fundamental like that actually needs some kind of guidance from the legislature before it can be applied?
That's a great question. I know courts, and especially those who lead the courts, and really just anybody, be it government, corporation, nonprofit, doesn't matter. Whoever leads the organization has to always be concerned with the legitimacy of that organization or that group or that court, right? So I can't honestly say, after, reading so much about Roe v. Wade and Dobbs and all these other rights, say that whatever decision the court makes, that they won't be judged for it, that they won't be attacked for it, that people won't have concerns with things, and especially when it comes to substantive due process, when it comes to fundamental rights like these. A lot of people would, for lack of a better phrase, say that the court made them up. I understand that point. I know Scalia talks a lot about it in his dissents in fundamental rights cases, substantive due process cases. But I think that there's plenty of evidence here. There's plenty of information. There's plenty of logic and reason to say that the court is not just making this up, that this is a legitimate thing, that there are legitimate reasons why it should be a fundamental right. And as such, I think the court is within its power to decide it. Of course, it is some judicial activism, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The people on the court are there for a reason. They're there because they're the best that we have when it comes to law. And I think, each person comes to one of those seats with their own philosophies, their own ideas, their own opinions. And if it can be firmly rooted in law, then it should be.
And I just have one more sort of substantive question for you. In your comment, you do say that the main focus is always on the individual's right to either conduct, to refusal of medical treatment, or to physician-assisted suicide, the continuation of medical treatment. And you really emphasize this idea of the individual's rights. But in this case and many others, we have physicians who are coming in as parties to the case. Do you think it's appropriate for them to have standing rather than the individual patients? Do you think that that's harmful to the precedent if we root that right in the physician's right to practice rather than in the individual's right to choice?
That's a great question as well. And unfortunately, it's not one I've spent too much time on. Obviously, in the paper, I spent a lot of time talking about substantive due process. I think a lot of that question hinges on medical ethics and the role of the physician. Now, I do see some caution over the fact that you have someone who's not an attorney representing the claims or the concerns of a person in a court of law. That obviously has some concerns, but, we have guardians ad litem, we have, trustees of estates, things like that. I don't think that a physician representing the interests of their patients is all that different from those kind of court-appointed positions. Especially in the case of physician-assisted suicide, where these patients really are restricted in what they can do, and plus they only have 6 months to live, and no civil court is going to last only 6 months. It's going to take way longer than that. So I think it's important for the physicians who also, keep in mind that the physicians are the people who see it. These are the physicians are the people who work with these patients, who understand it better than really anybody else. I think that these physicians are in a good position to bring claims like this before the court. But there's a lot going on there. Obviously, like I said, there's medical ethics, there's legal ethics, there's court precedent for procedure, there are civil rules, a lot of things that I haven't fully examined in order to be able to make a complete opinion on that. But I think with necessary precautions or protections, that physicians should be able to fill that role.
I was just curious if there were any points in your paper that you really wanted to highlight for our viewers or our listeners. I know you spent a lot of time working on it, so I'd love to kind of chat with you about anything you felt was super important to the topic.
I think your questions have adequately brought out everything that I would like to say. I think you've done an excellent job of going through it and picking out the salient points that I'm trying to make. Well, I call them salient. Who's to say if they're salient? I kind of have a biased opinion on what it might include. But really, the point I think I would like to make more than anything is incorporated in the title. It's not about, it's not about how we die, but it's about how we live. We each make decisions in our lives that are essential to how we want our lives to go, right? Every decision we make has an impact on that. But the most important thing maybe is that life ends eventually, and that how we choose to go out makes a substantial impact. Having control over that is the only peace of mind you can really get before the end. That being said, I would also like to note that, the state has a lot of compelling interest in preventing suicide. Mm-hmm. Suicide itself is a horrible thing. It always has been, and it always will be, and it's a horrible waste of life. But that being said, I don't know if the compelling interest in this case, where people have 6 months to live, where they have no option of recovery, where things like that occur, where they need peace of mind, where they need to have this calmness, where they need to have this last bit of control, I don't think the compelling interest to prevent suicide overcomes this as a right. That being said, we still need the protections as we've discussed previously.
Yeah, and that kind of goes to your title and the point you were making about life expectancy versus quality of life.
Right.
This idea that, why continue for 6 months if it's going to be 6 months of suffering that has a deep impact on the way that someone lives, when we could give them the autonomy and the right to that private decision making.
Right. And, there's, the other thought of when suicide, in the early days, suicide was illegal completely, right? Mm-hmm. And if somebody committed suicide, if somebody died as a victim of suicide, their families, their friends were heavily impacted on that choice. The government, restricted their ability to get inheritance. They were just treated so poorly, the victim and the families. We've changed the laws so that that's no longer the case. But when it comes to physician-assisted suicide, by keeping it banned, by keeping it outlawed, by not establishing it as a fundamental right, the impact on families that we tried to avoid by changing the laws on suicide are still in effect, right? Mm-hmm. Loss of, finances. You no longer get to see your family member who's dying as they were in life, mm-hmm. right? Speaking from my own personal experience, I don't mean to get too far into this. For as long as I saw them in those last few months, they were suffering. Mm-hmm. They were no longer themselves. They were in either exquisite pain or they were given pain-reducing substances that altered their personality. Mm-hmm. They were no longer themselves. And while I'm grateful to have whatever time I did with them, I would be short-sighted in not recognizing the negative impact and the harm done to family and friends by not giving people the ability to control their death in those last 6 months of life, when it's determined that you will not continue to live. So I think it's important, and in this sense, it is somewhat deeply rooted in history and tradition, is that we are trying to prevent harm to the families by allowing others to take control over their own lives.
I think that's a great place for us to wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share, or anything you would like to pose to viewers or listeners?
Well, I would first just like to thank you for taking the time to speak to me. It's been great talking to you, and I really appreciate your questions. They were very detailed, and like I said, I think you hit on what I'm going to call the salient points of the paper, so I'm happy about that. Honestly, I'm just happy if anybody reads it and considers it, and if this helps people in some way or another. I don't have any other last points other than those, but again, I do appreciate it, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for all of your wealth of knowledge, and for sharing with us a little bit about your personal relation to the topic. It always helps to kind of ground the topic in reality.
Right.
Marcus's paper will be out for the fall issue of the New England Law Review, so keep an eye out for that when it comes out and give it a read. It's a great paper. I read it. Excellent paper. From New England Law Review, this has been Lex Personis. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to catch you in the next episode. Today's episode was edited by me, Agripino Kennedy, and I want to give a special thank you to Dantes Nava for our intro music. We'll see you next time.